So good day to everyone. Welcome to this webinar. And today we will be speaking on Dynamics 365 FNO data exports using Azure Data Lake and Azure Synapse, a real life customer story. Um, the webinar itself is pretty technical, so we'll see how it goes, and hopefully I'll be able to share some insight with you, and you'll be able to gain some new knowledge in this data export topic. So before we start, this webinar will be hosted by me. My name is Ignas. I work as a Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain Management Solution Architect at Companional. And few sentences on the agenda. So we will focus on the main agenda topic, which will be the synchronization process of data from Dynamics 365 to Azure Data Lake. We'll explore the Azure Data Lake storage concept. Then we will also discuss what Azure resources do we need in order to run successful data exports. And we'll take a look at few key components that are being used in the most common Azure Data Lake export scenarios, and that is the Common Data Model Utilization tool, and also Azure Synapse as a data analysis tools and integration tool. We will have a Q&A at the end, so if you'll have any questions related to the webinar topics, but if you have any questions in general, feel free to write them in the chat. I will address the questions at the end because some of the answers might just come up during the presentation. So write all the questions in the chat, and then I will address those at the end of the presentation. And before we start, just a few sentences about Companional. Companional is the company that is hosting this webinar, and this is where my background is coming from. So Companional is a partner-to-partner organization working only with partner channels, directly with the partners. We have a very global imprint, and we're part of the Microsoft Inner Circle member. We offer services to the partner network. These services include distribution services on SMB ERPs, and these ERPs include Dynamics 365 Business Central and Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain Management. Also, distribution on Dynamics CRM and Dynamics Sales. We're a indirect CSP provider, so we resell Microsoft licenses for the Dynamics partners, and we're also a development center. This is where I'm personally coming from the technical services team, which is responsible for running projects together with partners, helping them in implementing the customers, performing development work, migration work for the ERPs, and performing other kind of technical services. Today, one of our services that we do is we try to enhance the partner channel and share our knowledges that we get from different projects. And today, one of those topics that we're addressing is from a real life customer story that was successfully implemented, and Companional was part of that project. Here, before we start into the main agenda, which is the Azure Data Lake exports, we will have a quick poll question to you. You should see a pop-up coming up on the screen, where we will ask you on what is your experience with Azure Data Lake? Have you implemented it? Have you seen it? Have you used it? Have you run some exports from it? So a very quick question just to get some engagement from the audience. And then I will share the answers with you. So just a quick double check on you, and let's see. Are you using the Azure Data Lake or not. So currently, most of the answers are coming in as no and no, but planning to, which is good from my perspective, because then there will be quite a lot of good information, hopefully, that I can share. There is one answer that is yes, that is already in use, but we shall then we will share some topics on how this can be used. All right, so most of the answers are on the planning to and no category, which is, of course, a very good thing, as we can then go into the main topics. So that's it. What we will explore is we will explore this main support data flow, which is used by Microsoft as the best practice. This should be a company's starting point when discussing the exports to data lake. And this data flow is used for data and analytics and big data volumes. So we're talking about data analysis, data volumes, big data. So that could be your ledger data, financial data, everything that is on the high side, not as a document-based integration, but on the high documents. And we're going to look at this flow. This flow was implemented in multiple customers organizations, and it is proven to be quite successful and quite working. So we'll go through this one by one, and we shall see how this looks hands-on and how this looks in once you actually implement it. So to start with, on the left side, we'll start with Dynamics and the data lake integration. This is the first piece in performing data analysis on your data that you have in the F&O environment. So in order to start with the data export, what the company needs to do is you need to set up Azure Data Lake extension or Azure Data Lake add-ins. With the newest version, Azure Data Lake extensions are quite easy to install. I just recommend using a sandbox environment and a tier 2 environment, not a development tier 1, because then it can become a bit more tricky. But running on sandbox environments. And when running on sandbox environments, before setting up the connections, you will need to install the add-in, and that can be installed using LCS, using Lifecycle Services. And here at the bottom of the screen, this is how the add-in looks once it is installed. To install it's rather easy. You just click the install new add-in, and then it will build the required integration for you. So it's running behind the scenes, and that integration will be installed. When you install this integration, you will just need to provide these parameters here on the left side. So you will need to provide a storage account connection, Azure Key Vault connection, application ID, and application secret. Now, full details of this I can share later on in Microsoft's step-by-step guide, how to get these values. But if you've done any kind of services and integrations in Dynamics, this is the same setup. App ID and app secret, this is like service password and service identification. Azure Key Vault is just used to securely store the secret identification. And the only unique part here is the storage account connection. Azure Data Lake itself, it is stored on a storage account within a Azure subscription. So you will need to decide which Azure subscription you're going to use. And then you can make a connection to any kind of storage account installed on that Azure subscription. So one key to understand is that you will need to have an Azure subscription in order to run Data Lake, and you can have full control and full access into the Azure Data Lake, the data, and everything inside, right? So it's a bit different than you typically have with the production environment, where we don't really see the infrastructure behind. Azure Data Lake, you have full access, you have full control, and you can see the data, near real time in your storage account, right? So once the setup is done, then you will see that you have this form available in your Dynamics 365 instance. That form is called export to data lake. And in that export to data lake, you will see all of the tables that you have in Dynamics become active and available. And then what you can do is you can select which tables do you want to be synchronized into the data lake, right? So you can pinpoint and you can do cherry picking into deciding which tables can be you will want to perform exports on and synchronize. Here in this screenshot, we're activating the general journal account entry table. So one table is being activated and the status is running. Now, the beauty of this integration is that you don't really have any control on it, meaning you don't control which data is being exported. You don't control when is it being exported. You don't have any options. In reality, it will just be exported behind the scenes, and you will see the data in data lake in near real time. Near real time meaning it can take from a few seconds to maybe 10 seconds, sometimes 30 seconds to see the data in the data lake, right? So for example, if you create a new line in this selected table, so you create a new record, that record will be synchronized as is without any logic on top, without any validations directly in the data lake within, let's say, 30 seconds. Right. So you just activate it and then it automatically runs. You don't need to do anything else. You don't need to activate, configure connections, set up intervals, set up timeouts. It just runs. Right. Here, the second screenshot, it shows you how it looks in the data lake itself. So first of all, we have the location at the top, and that is the storage account that we have, Dynamics 365. The storage account connects to Companion Demo Sandbox, which is simply a sandbox environment. And then you will have the structure of your data lake. So first you'll go to tables, which will store all of your tables as is. So they will store your table schemas. And then it will separate the tables based on which business area they are coming from. So for example, the finance related tables will go into the finance. The supply chain tables, like related to warehouses, orders, and so on, items will go into the supply chain, etc., and so on. And in the finance, we can go into another subcategory, ledger, and then we go to transaction header, which for you technical people, you know that this is the table group. So this stores based on the table group, and this transaction header then will put your data inside the transaction header folder. And this is how it looks. Once we activate general journal account entry, it will create us a dedicated folder, which has the same table name. And within that table name, you will see your data coming in. Right. Now, what is important to understand here is that, first of all, you can deactivate integration if needed. So then it will stop working immediately. Another thing is that all the table schema that is being replicated, it will automatically, if you introduce changes, right, you introduce an extension where you add a new field, that will automatically be handled by the data lake export, and you will immediately see the changes in the file structures, and your new field will just appear. So it will just appear, and it will have values just as if it was from the very start. So you can make tables and schema changes, change them up, introduce new relationships, indexes, or fields, and the data lake integration will not be affected pretty much. It will automatically replicate your changes. You don't need to resynchronize. You don't need to stop the integration. You can just use it as is, and it will automatically reflect your changes during the next export. How does it do that? Right? How it's able to see the changes? So it's able to do it because how the export works is that the actual schema or the columns in your table, they are being stored in separate files. So these files are typically called CDM files, and you will always have two or at least two CDM files. One will just be a CDM file, and the other one will be a metadata file. These ones you can see here at the bottom of the screen. We have general journal entry CDM and transaction header manifest. So in here, what these files do is they store the metadata properties on your table. So you're able to put your table schema in this separated file, right? So for example, here on this right big screenshot, we can see that if I open it up, we have fields like transaction type, transaction date, data area ID, acknowledgement date, document number. These are all simply fields that we have in 365, but they are being stored here where they detail the definition of the schema. So each of my file that gets generated during the data lake export, it will have these columns, right? So it will have document number, document date, counting date, and so on. And the properties will also be stored within these JSON files. So for example, here, the document number, we have maximum length, which is 20, right? So that is your string size, and that prevents you from having longer than 20 length lines and records. Right? Your exports, they will generate files. So here, for example, we have general journal entry 0001.csv. That is a full table export that was performed. So, for example, initially, once we run the initial export, it will create this file, and that will be a CSV structure, and it will only have the raw data. Important to understand is that, first of all, data is in CSV, so it's comma separated. Second of all, it doesn't even have a header. It only starts with the actual data separated by comma, and everything is as is. So all of the rec ID fields are just like rec ID fields, and everything is as is. Now, the whole point is that you need to combine this source file that contains the data with your CDM/manifest files. That way you're able to read it, right? You're able to read it. But Azure Data Lake itself, it only stores raw data and the structure that tells how the data should be consumed, right? For example, the length, it's only up to 20. You won't have longer than that. Or that some field allows null values or doesn't allow null values. So then it is up to us to build the other components in order to consume this data that is being put in the data lake during each export. Now, Azure Data Lake supports two types of data flows. So it supports full pushes or full exports, and these full exports are happening all the time. And you will always have one file, which is the CSV file here, and that CSV file will always have the full data. So if you want to read all the data within a table, then you go in the general journal CSV and you read the full data, right? So it will, whenever it forms an export, it does a full push, right? So it re-exports everything. The alternative is having also incremental pushes or incremental exports. Incremental exports are used also very commonly for data pipelines when you want to reduce overhead and you want to reduce cost, so that you don't need to read the full file every single time and then perform whatever you need to perform. You can only read the incremental pieces or the changes that were exported since the last time run, right? So you get the delta. In this case, the data lake stores a change feed folder, and we could go in and discuss it in very depth. How does the structure stores? But that's not the point here. You can also find documentation on how it stores the data. The idea is that if you enable incremental pushes, then what it allows you to do, these incremental updates, then it will only push the changes introduced in the table. These changes will be stored in a separate file, so not in the same file that has the full push, but a separate file that we call the change feed or CDC also. And these will have the changes that were introduced since last time. So here on the right, we have a screenshot just how it looks directly from the CSV. Each time I introduced a new insert, let's say to our general account entry, it generates a new record. So then it says that there is an action that was done, which is insert. So new row, new row, new row. And these new row values will be equal to whatever the actual values are. So it has the same exact structure, but it introduces as the full push, but it also introduces few new fields so that it's able to tell you that, okay, there was an update, there was an insert, there was a delete, and it's also able to tell you that when that happened and which record is it linked to. So you have incremental using this change feed structure, and then you have full push, which is done using the full file. Right? Now, from here, you have your data in your data lake, which is in the middle. Right? The next piece is supplementing with additional components in order to read or consume this data. Right? By itself, it just stays there, and you can't. It's pretty difficult to perform data analysis on it, just because the structures are not in a SQL structure that we're used to, but they're structured as files, right? First of all. Second of all, the properties is stored in a separate JSON files, metadata files. So if you want to consume this, you need to be able to read both, right? In your application, whatever data analysis you're doing, you need to be able to perform both. Now, depending on the application that you do data analysis from, for example, Power BI is able to consume this, and you can have a direct connection to data lake. But there's all kinds of data analysis tools that an organization can run, and where we implemented this, the organization was running a different tool than Power BI, and also they were introducing other components, and the data lake was just only the D365 exported data, not the final data warehouse that was being used. So in order to consume the data, Microsoft supports or proposes using a middleware component, which is called the CDM utilization, or Common Data Model Utilization application. And this application can be seen in two different ways. You can see this application as a Azure function, or you can see this application as a console app. Now, what does it do? In both cases, it does the same. This CDM utility allows you to read the data files and the manifest files. So it reads the actual data and the structures in the data lake, and it is able to convert the metadata into a nice SQL state. So this tool was built by the Microsoft Fast Track team, and it's available to be downloaded from the Fast Track asset library, which I have here in the link. You can find it there, and you can download it. It can be used for implementations. Microsoft is fully aware of it, and it's recommending it for the Fast Track, recommended by the Fast Track team. So this tool, what it does, it's able to read your manifest files, right? So it's able to read this JSON structure that you have, and then it's able to build a SQL statement pretty much from that structure. And then you can deploy this application, and as I mentioned, in these two different solutions. Now, by itself, if you it's only used to actually build the SQL statement. So it is used to generate you a nice definition of the table in a SQL way, because we store it in SQL, right? Then Data Lake puts it in files, and then this is used to put it back into SQL. So with this approach, we're able to get a nice SQL state, right? Now, the tool itself, it doesn't run SQL statements. It's not a SQL server, right? So it just gives you the definition in a nice SQL way. Right? Now, what we do with it is we really need to combine it with something else, because by itself, you can get some SQL statements, but then you need to run these. somewhere, so you need to have some engine that's able to run these generated state. So in most cases, Microsoft recommends using Azure Synapse. Now, you could use other alternatives, not only Azure Synapse, you could supplement with other pieces, but Azure Synapse was used as the default engine, and I'll explain why in a moment. But the CDM itself, it's also able to handle your schema change, right? So remember when you introduce a new field to a table, that new field introduced, it introduces a schema change in the data lake, right? So that means the CDM files, they get updated. Now the util, it's able to understand that there was an update in your CDM file structure. And then it's able to give you the updated SQL statement, which you can then again run in Synapse or run in some other Azure service. So it handles it in two different ways. If you want the schema changes to be handled automatically, then you need to deploy it as an Azure Function app. This Azure Function app, if you're aware with Azure services, it's simply a web service that is running on demand on your Azure subscription, and it is being triggered by an event. This event, this is being raised from your Azure blob storage. It's the default Azure blob storage feature where your Azure blob storage can raise an event, for example, when a new file gets uploaded, when the old file gets updated or deleted, it raises an event, right? So the whole logic here is that you have your nice here at the top, you have your nice schema where whenever your CDM file gets updated, it raises an event, right? So that's a default event grid feature. That event then is being passed to the function app. The function app generates a new SQL statement based on the change, right? And then it sends the SQL statement to wherever you want, right? We're going to look at Azure Synapse, but technically, if you wanted to, you can run it with other Azure computing services, right? You could supplement it directly to Databricks, or you can supplement it directly to somewhere else where you need it to, right? So that's what we have. The bottom one, it works the same way, except here you don't deploy it as a function app, because function apps, they still incur some costs, and it's an extra component. But it's good because it's automated, so you don't need to do anything. Event gets raised, everything gets updated, you get new SQL statements. With the console app, you need to run it manually or periodically as a batch process. So in this case, you would open an app, you click a button, run, right? And then it runs and it looks at your Azure Data Lake CDMs. So it looks at your definitions, and then again, generates new statements that it sends to, let's say, Synapse to perform updates on the schema. So this one you need to run either manually or set up as a recurring job, right? So that means that when you actually introduce the change, you still need to do some step or just leave it at timing. With the first approach, you don't need to do anything. It will automatically be updated pretty much in real time. So CDM acts as this middle layer in order to put your statements into a SQL statement, right? And then that SQL statement, it can be consumed and it can be used by some SQL engine. In the Microsoft example that we have, we're using Azure Synapse. And why Azure Synapse? Azure Synapse is being used because it's a very strong tool that can be used for data analysis as a standalone app, right? So if you want to perform standalone data analysis, for example, you can do it directly in a Azure Synapse, right? Also, it supports connections from very multiple different devices and big data systems. So that means that here we're just connecting FNO, right? But if you have different applications running alongside FNO, you can also integrate everything in Azure Synapse, which can be used as an analytics service. And then if you want, you can push the data forward or you can perform data analysis directly in Synapse. Also, Synapse as itself, it can be deployed on based on a SQL. So it can be a SQL dedicated pool, or it can be a SQL serverless pool. So you can have essentially multiple SQL servers joined into a pool that are running and giving you a dedicated database in SQL, or you can just have it on demand. Right? For example, we use it on demand when you're not performing Azure Synapse analytics directly in the application in Synapse, but you're just pushing the data into another final stage, which is, let's say, the data warehouse that the customer has on premise, for example, or on the cloud, doesn't matter, but you're pushing it away. So then Azure Synapse is simply used as an engine to be able to run the SQL statement, get the actual data, right? It's able to get the data, and then you can push the data using the same Synapse into the final repository. Right? So typical scenarios that we have with Azure Synapse, usually we have one of these three scenarios. Now, there can be more, but typically you'll have one of these three. First one, it means that you can create views or external tables on a serverless pool. So serverless pool, again, it means there's no dedicated SQL. You just create definitions of a view, an external table. That means you're not storing the actual data in Synapse, and you're just using it as an engine to run the SQL statement that you get from CDM util pretty much. And you're using it in an engine to digest the data and then push it somewhere else and store it somewhere else, for example, in your final data warehouse. Or if you want to just look at it or perform or perform some basic calculations, you can do it also. So with this approach, you're not duplicating the data. The data is still stored in Data Lake, right? You're simply using the Synapse as an engine to be able to read the data from the Data Lake, and then views, as you know, they don't store data. Right? External tables is also, that's what it's called, external, not internal, because it doesn't store the data. Right? So then you're pushing it somewhere else. You're digesting it in another application. The second approach, it's the same way, except you can also export FNO data entities. Right? So here we talked about tables, where you can just export one table at a time, right? Because usually that's the easy way how data analysis can be done, where you know the tables, you join them, and then you perform your data analysis. Alternative is using FNO data entities. As you know, data entity is already an abstraction. So when you export a data entity, let's say for a customer, you already have quite a lot of data on the customer. And the data analytics, the people that perform data analysis, they don't need to join every single time customer with the location, with the address, with the contacts, and so on. They can just read the entity and they have a single row. Right, this is up to them. The idea is the same, but here we have data entity. And the last approach, this is used when Synapse in general is used as a dedicated data warehouse solution. So that means the final place where data analysis is being done. So in this case, we actually create the tables, and the table and Synapse is used as a SQL, pretty much as a SQL database, a very big SQL database and powerful. But the data is being also copied into these tables, and then you're able to run SQL queries. You perform data analysis, right? And then essentially do your work in Azure Synapse. Azure Synapse itself can be connected directly using SQL integration services, and that's why we had it here as SSMS. So SQL Management Studio, you can connect directly into Azure Synapse, and you're able to read the data, see the data, query the data, and simply perform data analytics. Right? So this is used when you want to perform data analysis directly within Synapse. So then you actually want to store the data because it's simply cheaper and it's much more fast. Right? With these views, you're mainly using it to push it outside, and you're not storing the data. And these are some screenshots, simply how it looks. So here on the left side, we have the Synapse workspace. Here you can see the definitions under this data section. You have if you kind of zoom in, you can see there's CDC tables, CDC accountant, CDC accounting event, CDC cost table, CDC sales line, sales table. And then at the bottom, you simply have, without the CDC, you have DBO dot sales line, sales table, and so on. These are the external view definitions that were created by Common Data Model util. So I didn't create these manually. You don't need to create these manually. Common Data Model util is able to read, again, the model, the data lake, and then create you this definition in Synapse, right? And then you have a structural SQL rectangular table, right? And CDC, as mentioned, this is used for incremental. So it in here, for example, CDC cost table, it will only store the new records that were being updated or created, right? And the old one, the full table, it will store everything, right? So it will store as this, and CDC will register all the changes that are being done, right? So only the deltas or everything. And then, since this is based on a SQL engine, you can perform querying directly. You can run SQL scripts, so you can do a select directly from the table as if you were actually just using a SQL Server Explorer and running a dedicated SQL query. And here on the right side, this is the same. It's just how it looks. CDC General Journal Account Entry. That was our table that we had in the original screenshot. And then it has all of these fields. In the beginning, you have the technical fields that are used for incremental pushes. And then at the end, then you'll have the actual data. Right. And lastly, Synapse can be, as mentioned, it can be the final place where you put your data and it resides in it. Or it can be just another tool that is used as an engine to push the data from data lake into your actual place where you will store the data. So Synapse itself, it supports integrations and has a dedicated integration module built in. And you can build pipelines to read the data from Synapse. So essentially just run select all, right? So select newest. So run your SQL query and then push the actual data somewhere, right? So you can connect. Here on the right side, you can see where you can connect to on this activities node. So you can connect to Azure Functions, batches, Databricks. You can send it to another data lake if needed. It supports simple SQL, and it has, I didn't expand this, but it has quite a lot of tools where you can just connect to, and this is where you can send the data to, right? So it acts as a middleware to push the data in your final destination into your data warehouse, right? And then you can run Power BI. You can run Power BI on. Here it supports pooling requests. It also can be supported by pooling requests. So for example, you can schedule jobs directly in Synapse, and then you can push, for example, to Azure services, right? But in some cases, what we did, for example, when you have an on-premise solution and the data warehouse is on-premise, then you need to pull from the cloud. It's simpler. So when you do a pull from the cloud, you can just reside in Synapse, and you can just create recurring jobs in SQL that connect to Synapse, and again, just do the same statements for select all and select changes and so on. And then you read the data, you get it in your local SQL data warehouse, and connect Power BI to it, or connect some other analytics tool, run it, and then you can see how it works. One of the benefits, if you use Synapse as this solution to run the statement and push it, it supports monitoring workloads and integration work. Monitoring means that when you build your pipeline, you'll be able to actually see whether it was successful. You can get your notifications when it fails. You can repeat the same push again, and it can be triggered directly from Synapse, or it can be triggered also based on events. So for example, when it fails, it can automatically repeat itself, raise an event, and so on and so on. Also, once you install CDM util, it comes with a sample incremental and full export to an outside SQL that can be used. So Microsoft just gives you a template for full exports and incremental exports. to a third-party SQL. This SQL is, of course, on Azure that you can connect to, and then that is where the data reside. Right, so you're using Synapse, you're not storing the data because it's a dedicated analysis service, and if you want to store it, then you have to have a dedicated SQL pool. But here we just push it out, and then it's stored on some third-party SQL, and other applications that are connecting and also have data, they're also connecting to that SQL directly, and that SQL is our data warehouse. All right, so that was essentially what I wanted to cover. So if you take a look, and which we do just a quick recap of the whole process that we have, and you can find a blog post that covers how to set this up. But just to give you a rough idea how it works is that we have a service that exports to data lake, right? Then the data resides. Then we use this middleware solution CDM util in order to be able to work with the data lake definitions. Right? And this CDM util is able to be used when we want to create definitions in Azure Synapse Analytics, so that we don't need to manually go in analytics and then try to consume a data lake definition, right? Data lake CDM model, Synapse SQL model, right? And CDM connects the CDM to SQL, right? That's the whole point. So we go SQL, CDM, SQL. That's just how it was built. And then Azure Synapse uses the actual engine to run those SQL statements from the data lake, right? As if that was a SQL database, and then push it to either push it in a third-party data warehouse solution or simply store it somewhere inside and then run Power BI directly on Synapse. You can do whatever you want with this last piece. All right, so now let's see if we have some questions in the chat. Okay, so we have first question: for incremental push, do you need to have change tracking enabled on the table? No. So one of the good things is that when you have when you're running with data lake integration, this is not the BYOD integration, and this is not using DMF. So it is not required to have change tracking enabled. It actually does its own change tracking in the data lake itself. And that's the part I kind of skipped over because it's quite technical, but it does its own change tracking within the data lake solution. So you don't have to have change tracking enabled directly on the table. And the second question is, do you need to use pipelines in Synapse to update external tables and views if you're using CDM util? So you don't need any more pipelines in Synapse to perform updates. If you deploy CDM util as a function app, so that first approach at the top, then your Synapse views will be updated automatically. So the event will trigger the function app, and the function app, which is the CDM util itself, the function app will update your external view. So Synapse itself, it doesn't have to have any more pipelines. The CDM will just update the view directly in Synapse. Let's give it one more minute for any more questions. We have some more documentation on CDM util. I'm okay with Synapse and data lake struggling with CDM util. So I think I can share some documentation. I'll put it either in the chat if you'll have access to it. I'll just put it in the chat. If you won't have access, then we'll just send it out to the participants. So I'll send you over some documentation, and then hopefully that helps out. What kind of cost can we expect? So that's a very good question. So we didn't talk about costs. The beauty of this is that this is actually so the cost comes in from two main criteria. The first is the data lake, and the second one is the Synapse. Both of these have their own cost. The data lake cost is very small, so we're talking very, very minimum. Let's say up to 10-20 euros per month for medium data loads. And for the Synapse, it will really depend how often you run your pipelines and how much data you're going to consume. If you use the serverless approach, which just is based on how often you run and how much data you read, then it has a charge, and you can find it in the Azure calculator, how much it costs to run. If you use the dedicated one, where you just deploy it, then it will just be a static SQL Synapse that, it's like a SQL machine that's on Azure. So then you'll have a cost for running some size SQL machine, right? And then you don't get charged for each run of data, and then it doesn't matter how much data you query. So depending on which one do you works best, right? If you're doing once a day exports, then on demand is usually better, right? But if you're doing exports every 10 minutes or every half an hour or every hour, then maybe the dedicated one would be better. So then it really depends, again, how much data you're running. There is a calculator that compares BYOD expenses and Azure Synapse expenses. It was built by the Fast Track team. It's not the easiest to use, but it's kind of like an Excel template that gives you some insights into cost. So this Excel template I also can probably share in the link, because it's available online. So you can have a look, and from that you can try to build some kind of models on how much, depending on what workload you're looking at, how much would it end up costing. Yes, do you know if BYOD will be deprecated soon? There are some rumors about this. Yes, so it's is it soon or not? I don't know, to be fair, but I know that it will be deprecated. So currently, Microsoft has not released an official date. When is that happening? Usually, when they deprecate a feature, they give it at least a couple of years. When they say that they're going to deprecate, then there's usually a year for the actual deprecation. So you get 1 year to move to data lake, pretty much. That's usually how it works for most of the features. They announce, and then you get 1 year to move, to change. Right? So you will have definitely time to do that. When is that going to happen? I don't yet know, because they haven't decided. They haven't decided. But I can tell you that they're not investing anymore in BYOD. So there won't be any more features in BYOD, and it will just be as is. Right? They might introduce some fixes, some bug fixes, but there won't be any more improvements made. And now if you go and talk with Microsoft on improvements and how can it be better, faster, and so on, they just tell you to move the data lake exports. So that's my take on it. Exact dates currently, I don't have that knowledge. If you want to do transformations to the data, would you use pipelines or just do it within the SQL script that CDM util generates? It's a great question. So I would say depends. It depends if you're actually if you want to store the data in Synapse, or do you just use it as this vehicle to push the data somewhere else. If you're using it to push the data somewhere else, then I would say to do the transformation within the pipeline, which reads from Synapse. So keep the Synapse views equal to the data lake views. So using the CDM, just leave it as is, so that's 1-to-1. And then when you run your statement to fetch some data, then perform the transformation within the pipeline. So within the select that you select from Synapse. Right? If you're actually storing the data in Synapse, you're using this third approach, then you need to, when you perform the CDM update of the view and you create the view, then I would say that you would need to do the transformation at that point. So when the CDM creates these external views, if you're going to use real tables, then that is when the transformation should be done, so that you store the data immediately, pretty much. Yeah. Or also you can create. Now I haven't done that, but you can create another external view of a view which has the transformed data. So in the Synapse, you store the actual source, right? And then the transformation you put in a separate view. That can also be done. But yeah, I haven't done that hands-on. Great question. All right, thank you guys. So thank you for attending. If you will need to get in touch, just the final plug, get in touch at service@companion.com. It can be about anything. Just mention finance and supply chain F&O, and then it will be redirected to our team, and then we will address it. So whatever you need, get in touch, write us an email, and then we'll go from there. So thank you for attending. Hopefully this was a useful session to you. And until next time, have a great day.